like to welcome everybody today to Effective Collaboration for ESOL Teachers. Today's presentation is being given by Dana Gastick-French from Upriver Education. We're very lucky we have her with us today. My name is Elizabeth Dion from Demonstrated Success, and this is being put on today. Thank you to the New Hampshire Department of Ed. So if I can remind you to keep yourselves on mute. If you'd like to ask any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and I can interrupt Dana as we go to make sure your questions are answered. You can also unmute yourself at the end of the webinar to have direct conversation with her, or if the question needs clarification, please unmute yourself and join in. We are going to put a survey in the chat box at the end of the webinar. I'm going to put it in now and remind you to go back to it at the end of the webinar. We really, really value your opinions and your thoughts. So please take the 1 minute and fill it out for us. I promise you, we read them all and we go over every bit of information that people put on so we can serve you all better. So with that, I'm going to let Dana take over. I'm going to stop my video and say thank you again to all of you for joining us. Go ahead, Dana.
All right. Thank you so much, Beth, for that introduction. And thanks, everyone. It's really lovely to be here. I'm so glad to be back and partnering with Demonstrated Success and the New Hampshire Department of Education today. At Upriver Education, we are specializing in maximizing outcomes for multilingual learners. And I know that in New Hampshire, this is kind of an ever-growing and changing reality as our districts are diversifying and we're welcoming more multilingual and multicultural students into our schools. So I'm just really thrilled that you're all here for this conversation today. Okay, so as Beth mentioned, I encourage your cameras to be on. If you can, please come off mute and participate when when there are opportunities to do so, or put questions and ideas you have in the chat. This is really a conversation, so I would love to make it feel that way, and you're a big part of that. So here's our agenda for the day. Really, we're going to talk about collaboration, as you know, and some ways that collaboration can look. An hour is quick, right? So this is going to be a big overview, and we'll get into how this can look specifically in the context of an ESOL and classroom teacher relationship. However, it's really like the tip of the iceberg, because this could be a long series where we really unpack the sort of kind of larger scale systems level and role specific pieces to all of this. But I'm so glad you have this interest and you're willing to investigate and dig a little here today with us. So if you have a notebook, I encourage you to grab one. We often will take a minute just to reflect, take a few notes if you want. You will have access to the slide deck afterwards. Beth will share that with you. However, there may be times when we think, we reflect, and we kind of come back to that in the larger group. So today we're going to have a short icebreaker, and then we're going to talk about really the what and the how of collaboration. What can collaboration look like? What is it? What are the different sort of models for that? And then how can we begin to effectively build collaborative opportunities with our cooperating teachers within our systems, and then we'll do a little reflection before we close. All right. So I'd like to start us off with just a larger guiding question. I want you to brainstorm a little about why we collaborate. Right. So in life, in a sort of the bigger context here, we collaborate often, to plan a party, to cook a meal. If you're in my household, to build IKEA furniture. Sometimes we collaborate well, sometimes we don't. But why? What's the goal? So I'd love to, hear some thoughts in the chat about the intention behind collaboration, not necessarily school specific.
To get everyone's ideas.
Yeah.
Feedback and ideas. Strength in numbers. Yep, for sure. To get the work done more efficiently, to make sure everyone's on the same page. Collaborate to share ideas and learn from others. Multiple parties have the same goal, but each bring their own skill and resources to the table, right? And different ways of looking at it or going at it, addressing it rather, exchanging information to help all students. Yeah.
These are great. Yeah, this is wonderful. And really, it's that down to that core idea that collaboration is an additive process. The idea that we can each bring our strengths to the table. There's a lot of conversation about strengths, and teachers are individuals, right? And in general, in life, we have so many areas where we excel or where we could use some supplementation. And so the idea is that more would create a more comprehensive experience, right? We bring more than the sum of what we bring individually. Yeah, that's great, Meg. I love that. To complete a task more quickly or with greater success. Yeah, and in this case, so I want to take us forward here. Our objective for today is to explore really 4 approaches to collaboration, so that you can get a sense of the different possibilities for how this can look, and then also have you seek to identify the how, right? To identify a pathway to getting there, to whichever approach feels or approaches, because this may look differently depending on your circumstances in your district, school, or schools. And I'll suggest some things that you can do now, as well as some longer range pieces that you may want to have top of mind as you're looking at, how systems might need to be in place in order to make broader scale changes. All right. So let's do a little icebreaker. We're just gonna have a little fun with some figurative language, because at my core, I am a language geek, and I want you to think about group work, right? So remember group work, remember when we're in school and we have that project. So for me, this was like the first thing I think of is building a scale model of the Ponte Vecchio Bridge in Italy with a group of 4, and we had the avoider, we had should we add on this person who always wanted to do just like another thing, even as time was whittling itself away. We had the rule follower. I'm not sure which one of those I was. I'm sure with some of each at different points. But suffice to say, group work can be challenging, right? So I want you to think about this and describe, using a simile, how you feel about group work or have felt about group work as a student, right? From that perspective. So I'll give an example. You might say, group work is like trying to walk with your legs tied together, right? So do you have an experience of group work stressful? Absolutely. So think of a simile. Does anyone have any fun with some figurative language here? I'd love to hear it.
Do you want them to unmute themselves? Oh,
you can come off mute, absolutely, or put it in the chat, whatever your preference is. As sticky as a cinnamon bun. I love that, Karen. Trying to talk a dog off a meat wagon. Yeah, sometimes herding cats. Like those feel very similar to me, right? Good. Is like being stuck in a Kafka play. There's so much creativity out here today. Nailing Jello to a wall. Yeah. Like sewing clouds, right? I love these. I had a teacher say to me, it's like drinking raw eggs and calling it healthy, right? Like, you're like, I gotta do it, right? Good. These are just wonderful. Okay, so if you have any others, oh, I want to hear them. Let's see, like walking a tightrope. You're not always sure how to move forward, but you'll get there in the end. I like that. That's a really good reminder that, as long as we're moving forward, right? So my question here is, why was group work supposed to look like this, right? But often ended up feeling a lot like this, yeah? And it's just kind of one of those realities, yet we still do it, right? As teachers, we often ask our students to do group work. We know it's good practice. We know there are benefits to collaboration. Yet when we lack agreements and we lack structures, norms, expectations, it can be tough. So oftentimes there are these wars that happen, and I've observed and certainly experienced between content teachers and ESOL teachers, and oftentimes in other areas as well, in subspecialties, special educators, and all the different subspecialties that I really feel can be and should be prevented. And it means going upriver a little bit, which is, this idea of backing out and really having this plan in place. But ultimately, this is a larger effort, right? That needs to involve agreements at all levels, at teacher level, at administrator level, paraprofessionals, anyone who serves students, right? And in fact, when I was program director for an ESL program in a large urban district, we came up with expectations for collaboration, specifically for push-in classrooms, just to ensure all were clear. Because what we found, a lot like group work, right, is that everyone goes into this with really great intentions, but the frustrations mount when we have misunderstandings about our roles, or we're not clearly defining those. And oftentimes having those defined by a third party can really help in this matter. So this is a great place where working with administration can be a terrific way to really build out those systems and that large, sort of more longer term piece. So what I'd like to start with today is really the what, right? So our first objective is to really define collaboration here. So when we think about collaboration, I want you to really understand that this can mean co-teaching, and you'll see that that's one subcategory or area or way to approach collaboration. Sometimes we hear the terms co-teaching and collaboration used interchangeably. Today, I'm going to use collaboration as more of an umbrella term that could include co-teaching, and we'll get into what co-teaching, sort of some of those models can look like briefly today. Right. So all of this, however, is going to start with explicit conversations, right, and conscious commitment to collaboration, and really sort of calling out what that means, and having those professional conversations, establishing a common language together, and truly understanding one another's roles in the process. Oftentimes as teachers, we're part of bargaining units that look at us as one unit. However, our roles within that unit do vary a lot. Ultimately, we're all responsible for improving student outcomes, right? But how we get there may look a little differently, and we really have to be okay with things not being exactly equal or same in order to promote better outcomes, so that we can really dovetail our strengths together. So let's look at these 4 pieces. So consultation is a collaborative effort, and that would be between like a teacher or professional and another educator who is acting more as in the consultant role, right? So that we can really provide advice to one another and to collaborative partners. In this way, we're really maximizing specialty. Yeah, so for consultation to be truly collaborative, it's important for that conversation to be really two-way. So we don't want one person to be dominating that conversation, but we're really talking, instead of working directly both with the students, you're really, one of them's working to support the other who's working with students. So this might happen if you aren't necessarily servicing all of the students, but there are English learners that you have a cooperating teacher who's servicing and could use some of those pieces of specialty that you carry in order to improve their practice. Co-planning involves collaboratively developing either differentiated instruction. It could mean that teachers are working to develop lessons or assessments. It doesn't always lead to co-teaching. However, having those 2 minds on lesson design can be really helpful. Grouping decisions, really understanding and unpacking access scores, for example, and what does that mean in terms of this activity or that grouping. So these can, making other curriculum adaptations, really promoting accommodations that may be in place for an English learner. These can take place within professional learning communities, or just one-on-one during a common planning time, or meetings. Co-teaching, we're probably very familiar with and have heard about. So, and that's been really described as a way for two professional educators to deliver instruction jointly to a group of shared students. In general, this has to be, we have to create a setting for this to happen. And co-teaching really needs to be planned for. Sometimes teachers push in and to co-teach. Other times they are truly assigned, both assigned the same group. So there are a lot of different ways, and we'll unpack that shortly.
And can I interrupt for 1 second, Dana?
Yeah.
Hannah, do you want to unmute and share your comment on collaborating with classroom teachers, your hint?
Yeah. Oh, there you go. One thing that I do at the beginning of every year is I make a copy of the can-do descriptors for each grade level cluster. I include the access scores and from the previous year, and the page that kind of describes what the can-do descriptors mean in a little packet for each of my teachers that has my students. And it gives them and me a common language so that when I'm talking about, the student is at a 3.4, they understand what a 3.4 means in terms of what they're able to, whether they're able to, say, for example, a second grade, whether they're able to write a, full-on paragraph, or whether they're able to write just a couple sentences based on their level in that particular area. So it's just something that having language that is consistent, or so they see what my terminology is, and then we can have a discussion about that if they so choose.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, Hannah, that's really one terrific way to be really proactive in terms of communication. If you level setting, I think is so important, right? So what are the expectations of the classroom teacher? And when you show them that here's this great tool at the beginning, right? You're not coming in after the fact when that's more challenging. You're really establishing a partnership, a connection. And it's a great example of that consultation piece where you may not be present all the time. And in fact, what ESOL teacher has the luxury of being present all the time with students? Most of the time, it's our classroom teaching peers that have our students in front of them that we share. And for them to have these great tools in place, I think is a really, really strong way to advocate. So thank you for sharing that.
One other piece is I think it also helps them to realize, where their student is at in terms of what their abilities are because of their ESOL level, and helps them in grading, and helps them in differentiating for them as well.
Yeah, I always love to go back to, although I don't love the federal term limited English proficient, it's the deficit model. The definition is that students cannot perform ordinary classroom work in English. And what I like to say to teachers is they can't perform it in English without these scaffolds, right? It's the language, it's not their ability or their capacity. And so if you don't change a thing, then the expectation is they won't perform, right? So here's what you have, and just pointing them to those great tools is a really terrific way to do that. Yeah, thank you. So the last piece we have here is the coaching, right? And oftentimes this is where we have to have that built-in kind of time. And so instructional coaching, this is ongoing. It's really purposeful collaboration. Some of you may be in a coaching role or part-time coaching, but they help teachers really set goals, monitor progress, solve problems, and sort of attain their goals through strategy and support instructionally. And so someone working with the can-do descriptors, for example, might say, you know what, let's look at how we can move. What's next in terms of the natural progression of language within this speaking domain, right? How can we move that student along utilizing this toolkit of strategies that you have? So so coaching would be really sort of intentional and have that time laid out for it. All right. So what I'd like to look at now is this idea of really clarifying our roles. And so there's been a little conversation about this. I think Hannah's suggestion to provide the WIDA pieces and tools really does send a great message, like that, you know, look, we're all responsible for language here. But identifying the role of the ESOL teacher and the classroom teacher, and then both. So what are we responsible for in each of these roles, individually, collectively? What strengths can we bring? So what I would like to do is break you into small groups to really look at this Venn diagram. And just, I would like you to volunteer someone in your group, volunteer someone in your group to take notes on what you think is the role of the ESOL teacher in terms of, you know, some teachers who share students, the classroom teacher, and what's shared, what is both, right? So, and then what strengths can they bring as well? This could be responsibility, but it could also be sort of opportunity, right? So we're going to take 5 minutes in these breakout groups. And then when we come back, I'll ask a few groups to share.
Yep, I'm putting you in your rooms right now, and we'll give you a 1 minute countdown when it's done.
All right, are we all back? I think we're all back here. Welcome back. I am curious what you came up with. So I'm going to turn it over to you to either come off mute or throw it in the chat. I'd love some folks to come off mute and share what they felt the different roles entailed. Who was in our first group? Can we get a volunteer from our first group?
Feel free to unmute yourself if you're more comfortable with the chatter instead of writing in the chat box.
I can volunteer for the group that I had. I apologize, my camera's not working.
That's all right, go ahead.
So we talked about so I'm in group 5, and we just talked about how all 3 of us are from very different roles, and we don't really have the relationship or the connection that we would like with our ELL or ESOL teachers. I personally am a 5th grade special ed case manager, and I don't have the time or the ability to go down and see what my students are working on when they are pulled out for that time. We do a lot of co-teaching where I work, but mostly our ELL students are pulled out. So I'm not familiar with what they work with. I know what their goals could be, but I'm not seeing that kind of go full circle. And so we were talking about that more specifically in our group.
And I'll add on to that, because I was in the same group. And as we were finishing up and deciding how we would report back, I just noticed that none of us are like necessarily classroom teachers or ESOL teachers, but we all want to figure out how to help these kids more. So I think the role of both the ESOL teacher and the classroom teacher is just to figure out how to get the kids helped as much as possible. Collaborative.
I love that. I think when we keep that that's our why, right? And when we keep it at that front of mind, then I think we're going to really do great things. And one of the things that I think it was Irene that said is, we don't really know what one another do. And this, I think, is part of we'll talk a little bit about getting up front with communication and resources and perhaps even sharing some of that and having, resource pages where we're able to talk about what we're working on so that we can leverage. So if the ESOL teacher, for example, is working through the WIDA proficiency level descriptors and the standards, and perhaps is looking at the key use of argument, right, which is a great type of language to understand and to use, and you happen to be debating a history topic in class, wouldn't it be nice to know the language they're using to teach arguments so that you could then reiterate that in your content? And so much of language is iterative, right? We need to be exposed, I think it's to in 6 or 7 contexts, in even to just really take in a vocabulary word. We need exposures. And so if we're each re-exposing students to language within our own context, we're going to have such a great strength, right? One depends on your model in your school, Tish says. Yes, absolutely. And so we have a lot of teachers here that, I'm so curious if I could just veer off for a minute, and if you could just let me know in the chat quickly, just kind of barrage it with what your role is. And I'm really excited to hear that we have a kind of a cross representation. Special ed, L, pre-K, middle school, L. Yeah. Sheltered, elementary, intern, case manager. Great. High school, L. Wonderful. And then I'd love a quick yes or no. Do you have time to see cooperating teachers during the day, other than when you're teaching actively? Yes, no, emphatic no, sometimes. Nope. Yeah. Yeah, here's a real challenge, right? Not much, only if our prep's like, yeah, so like it's up to sort of luck a lot of the times.
It seems like nobody has the time.
Time's a real issue, right? And building in that infrastructure. And so go ahead.
I was just going to say, their prep time and my prep time don't always mix. Yeah. So I use a lot of email, and fortunately my teachers are, pretty good at getting back to me. So yeah, that's been really good here.
Yeah. I think, the nature, especially in lower incidence districts where there may not be, even in urban districts, you may not have an ESOL teacher for every grade level. That's kind of the pipe dream for a lot of districts. And so, our L teachers are tasked with interfacing with so many different professionals. I'm sure our special educators out there feel that as well. And so the time to do so, it's almost an impossibility, right? To even have that overlap unless we had kind of a one-to-one staffing model. So how do we do that, right? How do we create commonality, create common language, right? And when we think about this Venn diagram, I'd like you to think about how the roles, oftentimes it's not about what I do and what you do. It's really more about what happens in the middle there, which is that removing sort of the responsibility of who does what and augmenting practice. Oftentimes the L teacher will have a linguistic lens on content, and the content teacher has that content expertise in order to really put language into context. one of the foremost L researchers is Cummins, who has this quadrant, right, that talks a lot about context and learning language. The best way we learn language is context embedded, which means we really need one another in order to forward the learning. We need the language, of course, as the vehicle to content, 10 plus bell schedules, exactly. And we also need the content in order to bring context to language. So to really, even those short opportunities to say, hey, we're working on the life cycle of a plant this week. That is enough. As an L teacher, when I would receive that, I would say, okay, they need sequence language. I understand that. I understand the descriptors that are happening. I know some of the key vocabulary, that real tier 2 vocabulary, which is going to exist in any content area. So just starting to build that. But let's talk more specifically about how we can do this. So just going to move this chat. Everything's in front of me. All right. So how can these look, right? How can we look at these 4 ways of collaborating and think about how this can look in practice? Remembering, as you've pointed out, each district, each school has different amount of time, different amounts of access to their ESOL teacher. Asynchronous meetings are a great way that this can help, and we can use technology for this. And I think this is going to be one of the key ways, especially when time is short. All right. So what I've done here is we're going to start with this consultation model, right? We're going to break down these 4 ways to collaborate. And I've starred things that, may represent things that you may be able to do without that common time, right? So actually, and the first one really points to one of the pieces that that Hannah talked about earlier, right? So pointing out resources for your colleagues. You don't have to be in the same room at the same time in order to point them to the WIDA resources. Oftentimes this can look like a shared folder. So you don't have to individually email your colleagues, but you could have a shared folder where you say, you know what, this is going to be for this content area or for this grade level students, so that I can share as an ESOL teacher the WIDA levels and those tools and how to access those, because I'm more familiar, whereas my content teacher can really share what key assessments are coming up, and we can collaborate asynchronously. Of course, consultation can happen during team meetings or PLC time, staff meetings if you're allotted that time. But if you can't service all students, you can point to those resources, the can-do descriptors, language frames. In the resources today, I've put a link to a PDF called the Academic Language Function Toolkit. And this outlines really the most commonly appearing academic language functions. So think cause and effect, sequence, help me out here, description, compare and contrast, right? And all of these language functions are great because they're going to appear in every content area. They're going to be so useful in forwarding our comprehension and our ability to demonstrate our comprehension of content. The packet comes with sentence frames to sort of scaffold and help support that language for students, and their coordinating graphic organizer. So for example, that Venn diagram might be a great way for a lower proficient English learner to have that same cognitive experience of compare and contrast. If his peers are writing, a paragraph or an essay comparing and contrasting, perhaps the student can still build some vocabulary, and then maybe plug a lot of that into sentence frames. So anyway, sharing those kinds of resources are really going to be key. A Google Classroom, having a shared Google Classroom for professionals is also a great way, because then when articles and resources come up, they can be linked right in there as well. And if there's the opportunity to meet virtually, you have that standard Meet link right there. And then another option is with administrative permission, you could do a job embedded day where perhaps you take an hour and you go into a classroom and you observe and give consultation notes kind of in that moment, just to see how the student's performing in class, to get a sense of the content. This would be for the ESOL teacher, or vice versa, right? There may be a time during an open period where you could go in and actually see what's happening in the ESL room, so that you can get a better sense of how these skills can dovetail together. In terms of co-planning, this is really, you know, when two teachers or a team, right, can bulk plan with the ESOL teacher. This is a great time to identify language objectives that would be appropriate for the content, that would sidecar along your content objectives. Identifying language of content to incorporate, identifying L supports and accommodations, and adapt assessments or make accessible or some supportive language. Co-planning clearly requires time, but can be done asynchronously as well if you have a shared planning folder. But one of the biggest pieces to remember is that when we're collaborating, we're trying to build what we call parity, right? Where we're both equal professionals, which means we share all resources. So we're not going to, it's helpful to really give one another access to all the pieces that the students will see, so that we can find those connective bars that will help build the language they need, scaffold the content. It's also a great way to really address the social emotional pieces for students here, because if there's an ongoing conversation, then we're more likely to understand if students are having a crisis, or recognize that in a timely way, or just need some extra support. So co-teaching is really, really interesting, because there are, Friend and Cook have defined really 6 strong co-teaching practices. And if you do get into co-teaching and have that opportunity in your districts, then it can look differently, right? So oftentimes we say we co-teach, right? And we're given an opportunity to push into a classroom and join one another, but we don't necessarily have the co-planning time to go along with it, or the background in the theory around co-teaching to make it successful. So the 6 areas for that they've defined for co-teaching are 1 teach, 1 observe, which is kind of where they really can give a detailed observation of students and have a sense of how they're performing with observational information in class, and then teachers can analyze that together. So it's like a second set of eyes. 1 teach, 1 assist, where one person would keep the primary responsibility for teaching, while the other professional would circulate throughout the room, provide unobtrusive assistance to students, as they may need it. There's parallel teaching, where learning would be facilitated if they just had more supervision by the teacher, or more of an opportunity to respond. So in parallel teaching, you're both covering the same information, but you're teaching the class simultaneously and effectively breaking down the ratio, but you've agreed on what you're teaching and delivering that to a smaller group. And this may help English learners who are or more reticent to speak in a large group. There's station teaching, which a lot of us, I'm sure, are familiar with, where teachers divide content and students, and then they teach content to one group, and then repeat that as the stations circulate. And then you could have a third group working independently if you really wanted to break down those sizes. Alternative teaching, which where students might need specialized attention. In alternative teaching, one teacher takes responsibility for the large group, while the other works with a small group that needs a bit more attention or support, or different looking support. And then, of course, team teaching, where both teachers are delivering the same instruction, same time. And a Friend and Cook call this sometimes having one brain and 2 bodies, right? So you really can be in more places, you can tag team with one another, and this can work really well. However, a lot of times it's personality dependent. And I think And that's something to consider. All right. And then finally, coaching. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this because there needs to be time allotted in the schedule for this to happen. Ideally, students are not assigned to both educators, but the coach is advising on these students and really working, expressly with the classroom teacher to include supports and set goals and plan and really strategically achieve those goals, given the coach's expertise in that area. All right, so I want you to think about your school and what approach to collaboration do you use, if you do, or what approach could you use? What could you incorporate? So remember, those 4 approaches would be consultation, co-planning, co-teaching, and coaching. What do you think could work? You can throw this in the chat. You can certainly come off mute. Dawn says they use PLCs. That's great. Dawn, are those PLCs for co-planning time or are they more of a consultation?
So I'm a special educator. So the grade level teams get together for co-planning. And then I would go in and kind of offer assistance in regard to the students that I service and how they could best work with them.
That's great.
And what their needs are. Yeah. Thank you.
Great. So there's alternative teaching. Yep. Some co-planning. Google Classroom. So I'm guessing, Natalia, you're in a space where there's not a lot of common time, right? And you might need that asynchronous approach. All of them could work. Travis is saying, given the time to co-plan. Yeah. And so consultation, I think, is probably the method that works the best when we don't have that time. And then we'll talk about some long range planning versus short-term planning, right? What can we do right now? A lot of times it's that asynchronous piece. And then what can we, and then sort of making explicit what we do and what can we do long-term, which becomes more of an advocacy piece, right? Saying, you know what, these are the benefits of common planning and this is what we would do with that time. Good. Co-teaching and consultation. Wonderful. Seeing a lot of co-teaching. This is really, really nice to hear. Yes, working with newcomers and alternative teaching, that's wonderful because oftentimes they can go into a breakout group to work on those fundamentals of language. Shared folders, yeah, they're key, right? Yeah, I think consultation is terrific. I've been working in a few districts with teachers who just need a few hours, of one-on-one to say, can you please just take a look at what I have and create, some suggestions for how I could pull out the language and support. Yep, co-teaching, parallel teaching with a second L. That's really great that you have that. Wonderful. All right, so what I'd like to talk about next is really how, right? How can we build this? And I think a lot of you have a really great sense of what could work in your buildings and what does work. And I hope for what does work, how you could maybe bolster that, right? To include more examples and more resources for one another. The key actions that we can do to really build up our collaboration, because I think most of us are collaborating. It's really, how do we build that with intention, are to build up our leadership and advocacy skills, build communication, and then access for students to information and for professionals to one another. Yeah. All right, let's see. So when you think about each of these key actions, we can break them down into long range and short range, because really we want to understand that, we're not going to leave here today to solve, all of the pieces of co-teaching, but this may plant some seeds of thought for you in terms of what do you want to advocate for. In your resources, you'll have each of these slides so you can unpack these a little more kind of in your time and kind of go through them. I'll just review them briefly for us today. And then there's also an article from Coleraine, Colorado, provides a great resource on the web for teachers of English learners, both content classroom teachers, ESOL teachers, and specialists. And it talks about leadership at the teacher level. And the title of the article is "You Are Already a Leader." And it really, it points to the fact that the TESOL, which is Teachers of English as a Second or Other Language, or their part of their qualifications for ESOL teachers has leadership skills embedded. And it's the idea that they proactively serve as a resource and they take initiative to make changes. And so building up advocacy and leadership and really knowing what to push for in terms of good collaboration in your building and what to ask for is key. So in the long term, right, that could look like building collaboration and co-teaching opportunities and professional development for such into the school and district improvement plans. It might look like planning for infrastructure for new collaboration models, right? So this may be in the next year or two, would it be nice, right? Because those may need to incorporate budgeting or space considerations, right? As building and district leaders need to kind of back a lot of that planning out. Create leadership opportunities for educators who serve English learners. In the short range, this could look like providing resources. So I promise you, I did not plant Hannah, but you know, during class or before, right, bringing an anchor chart and saying, you know what, I see that you're doing a lot of cause and effect in this physics class. This anchor chart speaks to the language of cause and effect. And we can just put that on the wall for our shared students. Even if you're not there, this is a great opportunity to provide, to be proactive, right? What are the language functions? Look at that PDF in the resources and the sentence frames that you could provide to students or to their educator in during the classroom time. Taking initiative to make changes, right? So perhaps that looks like asking an administrator if we can use a building meeting to have some cooperative planning time, or to speak to one another about what we do and demystify that. And oftentimes we're more primed to collaborate when we understand one another. Ask for time with administrators to request those changes ahead of time. In terms of communication, right? This is a big piece, right? Building up and communication skills. And I think really having clear expectations district-wide would be a terrific long-range goal. So what is our policy for collaboration? If we're co-teaching, is there a policy on whether or not we're going to be pulled out of the classroom when substitutes are needed? Or is that kind of held sacred? What are the roles and expectations for language in the classroom, right? Are language objectives required? Are students' accommodations for language and classroom modifications adhered to? In the short term, this might look like offering shared materials, talking to teachers, creating tracking resources to say, I'm going to create perhaps a log of what's happening when I push into your classroom so that we can both really be on the same page in terms of what's next. Modeling parity, right? So when we talk about students, we don't talk about your students or my students, we talk about our students and really kind of believe we're both equal professionals, but we have we're coming at this with a different set of expertise, which is really a way to augment, like we talked about in the beginning with group work, why we do it, right? And then setting agreements for those in-class roles, right? How do we want, when we're in class together, how do we want this to look? Let's look at those 6 co-teaching structures and make a really explicit choice about them rather than winging it. And then finally, building access, right? So in the long range, this could look like getting that master schedule in alignment so that the students have access, or the teachers even have access to time with one another. That could be in how we adjust planning periods as well. Do we have professional development so that content classroom teachers have access to WIDA knowledge about WIDA standards and best practices for sheltered instruction? And do we have professional development for our special educators and our English learner teachers and our specialists in terms of, how we can work together to make this happen? And then in the short range, obviously using those asynchronous methods that we talked about, but really it's really about sharing information and getting that out there. So I'd like to give us a quote talk here. And this is, I'm sure many of you are familiar with her work. This is Brene Brown's Dare to Lead. And this is really coming from this lens that, everyone's a leader here, and we really need to embody good leadership in order to collaborate effectively. So she says, we avoid tough conversations. And this is a conversation, she's talking about what happens when leadership fails, right? We avoid tough conversations, including giving honest, productive feedback. Some leaders attributed this to a lack of courage, others to a lack of skills, and shockingly, more than half talked about a cultural norm of nice and polite that's leveraged as an excuse to avoid tough conversations. Whatever the reason, there was a saturation across the data that the consequence is a lack of clarity, diminishing trust and engagement, and an increase in problematic behavior, including passive-aggressive behavior, talking behind people's backs, pervasive back-channel communication, gossip, and the dirty yes, which I guess is, saying yes and not really kind of having your heart in that. But what I get from this is that a strong culture begets strong collaboration. And so much of that starts with leadership at all levels, which is really effectively communicating. I have seen the negative consequences of avoiding conversations about collaboration and being explicit from the start. And I think if I could impart one thing to you today, it would be bring it into the light and say, how should we collaborate, right? Really get agreements, set norms for collaboration so that when you do bring that resource, it's expected and welcomed, right? So it's funny, I follow a number of educators on Instagram, and I always love to see what's happening in classrooms. And this one woman is a terrific resource and has some great ideas, but recently has been sharing examples of kind of arguments she's been having with content teachers. And it's funny, this is a professional resource, yet this is happening. And I think what I see is that there doesn't seem to be any clear agreement about how collaboration happens. So when people are offering to help one another, it's taken as an affront. And so I think really having those kind of tougher conversations and saying, hey, what can we do to work together here is really well worth it in the long run. And I think probably the core of all success in life, right? So I want to leave you with this question, right? So how can I communicate more bravely to lead, to advocate, communicate, or to create access, right? Because those are those key moves that we can make in collaboration. And you could fill it into this frame if you like, which is I can blank by, and I'll give you an example. So start to think about that, throw it in the chat if you have one. One teacher that I worked with shared with me, she said, I can talk to teachers directly about scheduling changes instead of asking my administrators to do so. And this might seem small, but for this teacher, it became her goal, really, because this created professional parity. She was fearful of letting her teachers down, and so often asked administrators to have those conversations. But once she did, she developed a stronger relationship, which improved their collaboration. And then it led to more conversations about understanding, right, what one another were doing. Good. So by finding moments for face-to-face contact, even if there's a lot of online sharing, I love that, Allison. And I think I'm really glad you brought that up, because so often when we see one another face-to-face, we connect on a more human level. The policies are requiring educators to avoid, yes, they are avoiding the tough conversation. And how do we learn to grow? I agree with you, Connie. I can advocate for my students by sharing data, resources, and best practices with teachers. Absolutely. And Dawn, I would encourage you at the beginning of the year to invite teachers to do the same with you. Say, I plan on sharing things throughout the year. Is there anything specific you're looking for? And if you could share with me as well, right, to create that two-way piece would be wonderful. I love that. Good. So I encourage you all to come back to the why, right? And I think you all had a really strong why. Oh, these are great. I have to look at the chat again. By being more proactive, initiating the co-planning. I love that, Meg. Yeah, I can make sure to put students first by saying how I feel in a professional way that will allow co-teachers to focus on what is needed for all the students. Yeah, it's all personal growth, right? I can support students effectively by bringing student work to meetings to look at together. That is a really terrific step. Yeah, good. Ultimately, when we collaborate, we should be building and not dividing, and creating more value than we can alone. And we are, two heads is better than one, right? We can only get there if we step up as leaders. We need to model that. We're going to communicate bravely and create access to one another, to the great resources and knowledge that we all share, and to all the best practices out there. Yeah, so I am just so pleased with all of the input you've shared and just the great heart you've all brought to this conversation. I know an hour is so brief, but I hope this sparks some great conversation and work in this arena, because I do think there's a real power. And I would love, you can invite ESL teachers to your PLC and trainings. Yeah, invite. I love that. I can be willing to learn from my fellow teachers and admit that I don't know everything. Y'all are wonderful. What a group. So I think together, what I'd like to do is to transform collaboration from this back to this, right? Connie's asking where the packet of common language terms. So Connie, I have a resource page that Beth from Demonstrated Success will email to everyone along with their certificate. She said it takes about 24 hours, so probably tomorrow afternoon you'll have it. And it has the links to all of those pieces. Anyone, you can also, so please complete the survey. The link is in the chat, but I'm going to put it back in there so it's current. Let's see. And then if there's anything though that you so the resources are here too, but you'll see this on the page that you get. If there's any questions, you have this info at uprivereducation.com will come directly to me. Find me on Instagram, send me a DM. I would love to continue the conversation beyond this short 60 minutes. But I just want to say thank you to all of you for coming on here, really coming together. What a great representation of all the educators that represent our students. It's really heartwarming. So thank you. I'll be on another couple minutes if anyone has questions. And if not, you can look for that email from Beth tomorrow. Hannah, Beth will email you that certificate. Thank you so much.